Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the actual, historical, ideological battle behind the Jacobite rebellions. It's so easy to just get totally swept up in the mythology of historical movements and kind of lose sight of the foundational ideas that literally drove people to risk their lives. And honestly, the Jacobites are the absolute perfect example of this.
Think about it. Were the Jacobites just romantic rebels in kilts, or were they the last true defenders of a divine political order? We usually picture them as these romantic Highland warriors fighting for a lost cause, right? A tragic but heroic struggle. But the truth is rooted in a much more profound philosophical clash that, frankly, still echoes today. This wasn't just a squabble over who got to wear a crown. No, it was a fundamental dispute over the very nature of sovereignty, authority, and what actually makes a government legitimate.
So let's start with the absolute basics. The word Jacobite comes from the Latin Jacobus, meaning James, referring, of course, to the deposed Catholic King James. But there's actually a deeper, super fascinating etymological connection here to the biblical figure of Jacob. You see, the entire Jacobite ideology was built strictly on bloodright. We're talking an indefeasible hereditary and divine right, completely opposed to things like earned merit or parliamentary consent. This created a worldview so distinct, so unyielding, that scholars actually sometimes call this ideological territory Jacob's land. For a Jacobite living in Jacob's land, legitimacy came strictly from this divinely ordained bloodright, totally isolating them from the shifting, everyday winds of human politics.
Here's our agenda for today's explainer. We're going to start with the true Jacobite origins, compare bloodright versus parliamentary consent, explore the Highlander identity, look at the forging of cultural Jacobitism, and finally, examine the enduring Jacobite imagination.
All right, Section 1, the true Jacobite origins.
So, the path to actual rebellion didn't just happen overnight. It was triggered by a few massive, world-altering events. It all kicked off with the 1688 Glorious Revolution, when King James was overthrown by parliamentary decree and basically replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. Then we get the 1701 Act of Settlement. This explicitly excluded dozens of Catholic heirs just to guarantee a Protestant succession. And shortly after that, the 1707 Act of Union merged the Scottish and English parliaments together, drastically reducing Scottish autonomy. These massive systemic shifts were the exact sparks that provoked a series of uprisings. And as you probably know, this all culminated in the final, famous armed rebellion in 1745, led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, which ultimately ended in that devastating defeat at Culloden.
Moving right along to Section 2, bloodright versus parliamentary consent.
Back then, you essentially had this incredibly stark contrast between two totally dominant worldviews. On one side, you've got the Whig or Lockean concept of a social contract. Theorists like John Locke argued that kings only governed through a contract with the people. So, when James II pursued arbitrary pro-Catholic policies, the Whigs believed he flat out broke that contract, meaning Parliament had every right to replace him. But on the other side, you have the Jacobites and their unshakable belief in absolute divine bloodright. To them, the 1688 revolution wasn't some neat constitutional evolution. Not at all. It was a disastrous, illegal rupture. They saw it as an oligarchic coup where a bunch of politicians illegitimately usurped a monarch chosen by God.
The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that Jacobites viewed the monarchy as a strictly divine institution. End of story. They deeply held that a king was accountable to God and God alone. Because of this, acts of parliament that tried to alter the line of succession, like that Act of Settlement we mentioned, were viewed as absolute sacrilege. They believed in strict primogeniture and legitimism. To a Jacobite, the crown's descent by pure bloodline could never, ever be overturned by the whims of politicians or just some temporary majority. In their minds, true sovereignty simply could not be transferred by mere pieces of paper signed in a parliament building.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Jacobite Highlander identity.
Nowadays, we kind of just associate tartan with a generic Scottish identity, right? Plaid scarves, kilts at weddings, that sort of thing. But historically, its role was so much more pointed than that. Tartan wasn't just traditional clothing. It became a deliberate, highly charged political badge. Back in the 17th and 18th centuries, choosing to wear tartan literally signified your alignment with the Episcopalian and Catholic Party, the Jacobites, who were actively resisting this newly centralized British state, and the 1707 Act of Union. It was this bold, visual marker of anti-union sentiment and a fierce loyalty to a patriot history over an emergent British polity.
And this physical resistance was deeply, deeply tied to a concept called Dúthchas. This is the ancient Highland concept of land and kinship. You see, under Dúthchas, land wasn't merely real estate to be bought, sold, or traded. It actually belonged to the entire community and was just held in trust by the clan chief. This worldview completely clashed with the modern money-based feudalism and strict property rights being pushed by the Parliament down in Westminster. So when the Highland clans took up arms for the Jacobite cause, they weren't just fighting for a king. They are fighting to preserve this communal, kin-based social order against the creeping, inevitable reach of a centralized commercial state.
Let's transition over to Section 4, Forging Cultural Jacobitism.
So the military rebellion might have died at Culloden, but the ideology certainly didn't. It survived and actually evolved in literature and philosophy. Writers like Anne Grant used what we now call cultural Jacobitism as a really powerful counter-discourse against major figures of the Scottish Enlightenment, like Adam Smith. Where Smith was out there championing modern commercialism, the moneyed economy, and cosmopolitanism, Grant fired back. She argued that ancestral bloodright, indigenous connection to the land, and the deep bonds of kinship were morally superior. Essentially, cultural Jacobitism transformed into a philosophical framework to resist the rapid modernization and the tragic depopulation of the Scottish Highlands.
Just listen to this quote. "The tendency of the age is towards democracy, and the tendency of democracy towards harm." Wow. This ideological resistance proved to be incredibly resilient. Decades later, well into the Victorian era, neo-Jacobite organizations like the legitimist Jacobite League were still holding on to this intense anti-democratic stance. Disillusioned by all the documented parliamentary corruption and scandals of the late 19th century, they honestly viewed democracy as a fickle, corrupting, and completely accursed condition. They felt it just empowered plutocrats and eroded social order, and so they kept championing a return to the absolute stability of a rightful monarch instead. And finally, let's look at Section 5, the enduring Jacobite imagination.
Believe it or not, the legacy of this movement is actually still with us today, surviving as what scholars call the Jacobite imagination. Think about it like this. On one hand, we have our modern reality, a highly rationalist secular technocracy driven entirely by parliamentary democracy and commerce. But on the other hand, the Jacobite imagination persists as a genuine form of cultural resistance. We actually see this pop up in places like Appalachia in the United States and within Orthodox Christian missions. It manifests as this profound, almost aching yearning for a hidden traditional Christian order, constantly pushing back against the alienation of our modern, virtual, and highly technocratic realities. We even see this powerful echo in our modern pop culture and literature. I mean, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Return of the King taps directly into this deep-seated Western yearning for lost meanings and a legitimate, divinely ordained authority. Actually, Tolkien drew huge inspiration from Appalachian culture when creating his Shire, and he perfectly captured this exact sentiment. Just like the famous folk tune, the Sky Boat Song, which longs for the safe return of Bonnie Prince Charlie, this imagination speaks to a modern epidemic of loneliness and a really deep desire for an enduring, unbroken connection to the past.
Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought to consider as we wrap up this explainer. As we navigate our own modern political turbulence, with all the constant debates over the legitimacy of our institutions and the obvious flaws of democratic systems, will the ideological clash between inherited traditional authority and parliamentary democracy ever truly be resolved? The Jacobites might have lost the military battle on the muddy fields of Culloden, but their underlying questions about the true nature of sovereignty, community, and bloodright, those questions continue to challenge us to this very day.